Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be covering Anita Silver's Too Old for the Good of Health. This article falls in the category of what is health because it attempts to define and investigate the conception of health. But of course, it does this within the context of oldness, or at least it relates it to oldness and how conceptions of health affect the conceptions of oldness. And so we have an interesting mix here, but I think it is a good article because both topics, health and oldness, are interesting in and of themselves. And of course, when you put them together, that combination actually creates more of an interesting problem. It kind of brings out the importance of why we need to have good definitions, or at least understand why the definition of health is important, and how it could, in many ways, skew our thinking about different groups of people. So, the first thing that Silvers talks about is the importance of health, and so we'll start there. Um, there are two ways, I think, to look at this. One is some people argue that health is so important that if you have health, everything else follows from that. And so some people might argue, look, health is simply a sufficient, not simply, health is a sufficient condition for everything else. If you have health, then you will have hope and you will have prosperity, you will have success, and you will have a great life. Okay. And this seems a little overboard, I think, a little over optimistic about the power of health. But we can sort of understand, and intuitively it might be reasonable to believe that health certainly brings about certain levels of prosperity and success. But another way of looking at it is looking at health as a necessary condition for prosperity, health, fulfillment, well-being, those kinds of things. And that kind of makes more sense to me, at least, because it seems like even if you're successful in life and you have a great family and just a wonderful education, and you've worked hard for everything you have, and you would consider yourself to have a good life. If you don't have health, it seems like all of that is to some extent um, downgraded, right? So yeah, if your health is really bad, and it seems like the successes or the well-being in your other dimensions of your life seem to be downgraded to some extent, right? So health seems to be, at least intuitively, we can argue that common sense view of health seems to tell us that it's really an important part of one's life, right? If we're healthy, uh, this is a good thing. It improves our ability to succeed in life. If we're not healthy, certainly that could put a damper on many of our good fortunes. And so, uh, this is also true not only from the individual perspective, we can also look at this from the group perspective, public health, right? So health is vital also in that sense. It's so vital in some cases, right, that we use health statistics like life expectancy and infant mortality rates to gauge, the level of prosperity of a certain nation or group, right? So we might, we expect industrialized, advanced nations to have high uh, life expectancy, and we would also expect low rates of infant mortality. And yet, the opposite is true, right? We would expect, less less developed nations to have a lower life expectancy and also a lower a higher infant mortality rate. So these kinds of things are associated with well-being overall, and so health seems to be vital. It seems to be essential part of our existence. And this now connects it to social justice issues, right? Because if it is such an important part of my existence, right, many people argue that it should be a right that people have. It should be connected to a human right, right? So some people would think, look, health is so important for an overall well-being that that a government's role, in part, is not only to defend its citizens from foreign invaders, but also to protect it from disease and illnesses and sickness, and to help it live a good life. But living a good life, a necessary condition is health, and therefore government should play a larger role in assuring that its citizens have the proper health care treatments and resources available to them at all times within their lifespan. So you can see the connections, right? The importance of health, social justice issues. Now, um, the question about inequalities in health allocation of health resources is also a social justice issue, and an issue that arises also from, I think, that arises to some extent from the importance of health for one's existence, right? Now, all of this is fine up to here, but you see, we are assuming that we all understand what we all mean when we say health. This is a word that we use in many different contexts, okay? But the question is, what does it mean? What does it mean for a human being to be healthy? Well, this is very uh, this could be very controversial and contentious, and there can be many different kinds of perspectives about this. So let's talk about all different kinds of perspectives or viewpoints or lenses from which we can conceptualize this idea. First, we could talk about health as a kind of neutral thing, just basically descriptions of your functions, of your bodily functions. We have certain measurements that we take, and given those measurements, we can assess and describe your health. Okay, so that is a very scientific, neutral way of doing it. Another way is that we can implement certain standards or goals, and this is more the normative. Normative, remember, implies ought or should. So health can entail, or it can inherent in the conception of health might be the normative conceptions of what you should, what are your functioning levels, what are the proper functioning levels that you should have, right? So we would say that this is more of a normative conception of health. So, for instance, you might say things like a 6 foot, you know, 6'2" person like me should weigh 180 to 200. That's what health is, right? This is a normative conception of health. So if you do not weigh that, then you're not healthy. Okay, so I'm not healthy, by the way, according to that weight categories, and this could be a problem, right? So we can already see some disagreements, some contentions, some counterexamples of why this doesn't always work. So, but the functional definition, I think, is based on the biological functioning of the organism at what we would say a normal functioning type, and that is taken by kind of statistical sample. So, I mean, this is very normal. This is the way actually medicine is practiced in many ways, right? So, if you do blood work, they're going to do a glucose exam, a measurement. They'll do measurements for your sodium, your potassium, your chloride, your carbon dioxide, and they will have your they will have what they say that your value, right? They'll have what they found you to the actual values that you have, and then they'll have like standard ranges on the side. And then if you deviate from outside those standard, your potassium is too high, or your cholesterol is too high or too low, or whatever it is, right? So your glucose and proteins and so on, right? So this is the way to some extent. And, you know, they'll give you medication to make sure that it goes back to the standard range, right? So this is a very common kind of way of defining health. Now, I think there is another important conception of health, which is used by the World Health Organization, which is much broader. And that's an interesting conception of health, because this takes into consideration not only the physical well-being of the individual, but also the social well-being of the individual, which includes not only, physiological kinds of infirmities and diseases, but also things like human rights abuses, and even social aspects like your access to your access to certain resources, your employment, right? The kind of work that you do, the kind of family that you live in. Are you in an abusive relationship, right? That has to do with health, right? So I think that the World Health Organization uses a different kind of conception, one that is much broader to entail a much more open and classification of health that entails more aspects of what it is to be human, right? It's not just our biological functions, right? It's also our, mental well-being as well. Okay, are you happy? Is unhappiness an unhealthy trait? Well, my cholesterol's high, but I'm really happy. Or my cholesterol's perfect, but I'm very unhappy. So we have to take that into consideration, okay? Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because I think that if you define health in a certain way and we use that definition, that excludes people that are unhealthy, right, from that conception, given those parameters. And it also it might include people who are healthy but are really not healthy in some other perspective, right? So you have to be very careful, right? You know, and the other issue I think is that health is not. It seems difficult to think of health as an absolute value, or so. It seems like we're going to have to contextualize health. So, to some extent, some people will argue that it's impossible to define health because we need to know about whom you are talking about. Are you talking about a 4-year-old child living in Ohio? Or are you talking about a 12-year-old child living in Honduras? Or are you talking about an 80-year-old person living in Manhattan? Okay, so you can already see that there are different reference points. Okay, and so health might differ depending not only on the sort of not only on the category of persons that we're talking about, the age, the gender, the genetic, the ethnic groups, the culture, etc. It might also even depend on the geographical locations of the individuals and the groups that we're referring to. So already here we have a very interesting problem, right? And that is that it seems that health is going to have to be relativized. Now, if you don't do that, let's think about now these issues of health within the context of oldness. Now, when we talk about old persons, persons of an older age, first of all, it's hard also to define oldness. So what does it mean to be old? Am I old? Well, surveys have been taken, and of course, this seems to be somewhat relative to some extent, right? So if old literally means the number of years that you've been alive, okay, then all we need to do is sort of choose a certain kind of point within that lifespan, right? So we might say 60. But even that is difficult, right? I mean, that's kind of neutral and objective, but even that is difficult. So, for instance, if people surveyed about what is old, if they're under 30, their conception of oldness begins at 60. However, people that are older, for instance, if you interview people that are older, that are above a certain age, like 60, for them, old is 75. Okay. So, it makes a difference, what you mean by old, right? But we have certain physiological markers, but then if you go to those criteria, then you have a different issue. So you can have an 80-year-old person who's not old, right? Because if you say, well, oldness means that you have hair loss, right? There's certain physiological kinds of markers or criteria that we can use. You lose mobility, maybe you lose some memory capabilities, you lose certain flexibility that you had when you were younger, etc., and you become less agile. But let's imagine someone who is old in terms of years, but the markers has because of great discipline and exercise, those criteria, those physiological criteria don't apply to them. Then we wouldn't consider them old, and that seems kind of weird, right? So again, it's not that easy. There are again other elements I think that come together. There are social elements of oldness too, right? For instance, we could say that older people lose certain social powers in because they retire. That you might be a vice president of a bank and now you retire, and so you lose a kind of social markers, right? That held you as vibrant and powerful, and now you are a retiree. The social aspect may even consist of the way you dress, right? I used to dress up with my tie, my suit when I went to work. Now I'm in my slippers and my short pants because I'm retired. So there's also employment, which is part of the social employment, and of course, also financial, right? So if you are, if you're employed, that's very different from being retired, where you depend on your pension. So you have different financial situation, and your ability to spend money and travel and things like that may be diminished to some extent. But so let's say that there are certain, I think, even though we can't find like a specific necessary and sufficient condition for oldness that everybody will meet, I think all of these things are true. to some extent, right? So you do have certain physiological markers, you do have certain social markers, right? And you do, and I think age matters, right? So yes, a 104-year-old person is old, even if they have flexibility, even if they have incredible physiological uh, features, right? And I think a person that so you need a combination of all these things, right? Just because you're retired doesn't mean you're old. You could retire at 45, right? But if you're retired and you have the features and you have the age, right, then you have all of these combinations. So again, we can, to some extent, say, even though there's no necessary and sufficient condition for oldness, there are a combination of things that can, to some extent, tell us or allow us uh, to choose to select uh, to make out who is old and who is not. I mean, there will always be situations that are unclear. Okay, but now let's talk about health and oldness. Okay, so let's imagine that we have a category where that we all agree with that is very old, right? So 80 and above, and markers such as the loss of significant loss of physiological elements in the person's the way the person's functioning, biological functioning ought to be, or the proper biological functioning of a species typical person. Human being, right? So now you have a problem, right? Because if medicine is the purpose of medicine is to cure an individual, right, to bring them to normacy or to bring them to the appropriate range, right? You would think, a 20-year-old might go to a doctor and say, I've lost certain flexibility in my right leg. I would like to regain it. And you would put them in physical therapy so that they could regain that vitality in the right leg that they've lost. And this would be true for many kinds of illnesses and diseases that are treated in individuals that are not old. So the objective is always to regain that sense of normalcy. However, if we look at oldness, right, you have the depreciation of these faculties to an extent that, and the progression of the depreciation, continued depreciation of these faculties. That is what it means to be old, okay? So if you think of young people, you have faculties that are not completely developed, okay? But the progression, okay, is in the opposite direction, right? So the young person who doesn't have the certain agility, he or she is expected to obtain that optimal agility at some point, right? So there's a sense of potentiality here. In the case of oldness, it's the opposite, right? So the person who has lost that agility is not expected to regain it. Quite the contrary, is expected to continue to have a deterioration of agility. Now, the question is, if medicine, right, if healthcare is meant to help people regain their agility or regain their wellness, this seems almost futile in the case of old people. And the question then becomes a moral question as with respect to whether or not resources for medical healthcare should be allocated in to the degree that they are, which is quite high, to people who are old. Uh, After all, they will never be cured. I mean, that's inevitably the, the fact, right? So it's not the case that, oh my God, let's just, help them more because they're going to regain that agility eventually. No, that's not going to happen. So the only thing that you could do is maybe um, uh, decrease the advancing or deterioration of the agility, but that's about it, right? There's no sense in which you could cure oldness. So the question is the moral question as to the allocation of resources with respect to old persons. Is it moral? Is it ethical, or is it not ethical? Is it ethical to divert so much medical resources to cases that are futile? And I think it is an interesting question. And so I think that Anita Silver's response is that what we need to do is we need to reevaluate, reassess our definitions of health. Okay, and I'm going to read a quote, which I'm going to conclude with this quote, because the solution to the problem is not that we should not allocate resources to old people, is that we should think differently about what it means to be old and healthy within that framework, right? So what it means to be healthy, a healthy old person, is very different than what it means to be a healthy young person, or what it means to be a healthy midlife person. Okay, so this is what she says. How does biological functionality manifest in old age? That's important. What is expected? What is the normal biological functioning in old age? A stage of life when individuals are at a higher than species typical risk of encountering impediments to their usual modes of functioning. Okay? Or this population, there is a greater motivation to adopt or to adapt to alternative modes. Recognizing the characteristic of elder cohort is crucial for constructing a portrayal of health in old age. So it is important for us to take this into consideration when we conceive or think about health in old age. Such a picture must distinguish dysfunctions attributable to physical and cognitive deterioration from the disabling deterioration that often is their consequences, for these are different states. Okay, I need to just say one thing about this now. So there is a difference between I cannot walk as fast as I used to be able to walk. I am now 80 years old. I cannot move around, okay, physically, the way I used to be able to move around. That is a fact. So now I use a cane and I adapt, but I can still move around. If I didn't have my cane or my wheelchair, okay, something else, and my absolute inability to mobilize comes about. This could cause other mental deteriorations in me that have nothing to do with my physical state, such as a complete disorientation of my space and location. Okay? That, you see, is different than the physical thing. And what she wants to argue is that there are certain physical deteriorations that occur, and even mental deteriorations. But then these, if they're not taken care of or if they're not treated adequately, cause further, right, secondary deteriorations of other sorts or problems of other sorts. And what she says is that those are the ones that we need to prevent, right, by helping the elderly adapt and adopt new forms, new methods of functioning that allow them to uh, to not have the secondary causes of disorientation and things of this nature, or even the lack of self-esteem or value and things like this. These are not necessarily associated with the physical problems. So I hope that I covered some of the issues here, and it's a fascinating topic. Both what is health and what does it mean to be old? And so, at least to me, that I'm becoming old, it was a very interesting read. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.